Hello, everybody. My name is Chet Gablinski. My wife Sally and I own this property that's being discussed today. The property is about 8/10 of an acre. It was originally purchased and regraded by my wife's family in the early 1950s, and the home was built at that time as well. It's an old ranch-style home with a long access that's going in the north-south direction. Therefore, the sun is coming from the east and going over the west over the whole yard. Water off the house drains eventually into the Santa Leo drainage basin. The climate here is primarily a maritime climate with some heat and dryness coming in from the east. The soil here is clay with some coastal sand mixed in. Overall, this is an excellent climate for growing subtropical plants and avocado and citrus. We have citrus and a number of native plants and subtropical plants. The surrounding properties are primarily private property to the north and to the east, and association property to the south and to the west. Since the property has been landscaped for some time, it's a fairly mature one with a set of very well-established plants as well as some that needed to be redone. When my wife and I took over the property, we made a few major changes with the original plantings. First, we focused on water efficiency. So we upgraded the irrigation system with drip lines and rotating sprinklers. Second, we replaced the lawn on the east side of the property that's behind me with native plantings. Third, we replaced the ice plant that was along the banks with other ground cover that was more drought tolerant, ceanothus, agave, etc. And then finally, we opened up the view to the west so we could look over a broad expanse of association property that contains the golf course. Thanks for coming out and enjoying our property, and I look forward to any questions from the audience. Hope we can answer them, and look for the great advice that working with Cody on the great advice that he's provided us already to improve this property even more. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Cody Harrison and I own a small sustainability company locally called Corona Enterprises, which lately I've taken to calling a regenerative design build cooperative. We are working to end poverty and regenerate the ecosystems of San Diego and beyond, and we're here today with Chet Kaplinski at his property in Rancho Santa Fe, collaborating on the San Dieguito River Valley Conservancy's Next to Nature program, helping homeowners manage their landscape in a way that promotes biodiversity and other outcomes beneficial to the people and wildlife of this area. Today, we'll be exploring Chet's property, looking for opportunities where he could improve related to topic areas such as water management, organic material management, fire risk, home energy efficiency as it relates to the landscape, biodiversity, nutrient management, and more. Before we dive in, I'd like to give the caveat that I am not a credentialed landscape professional, and there are many individuals, companies, and nonprofits locally with far more expertise in each of the topic areas I just mentioned. We actually reached out to some of them to do this, but not everyone can take the time to participate in a program like this as a volunteer, so you've got me. We're just going to scratch the surface on these topics today, and we'd be more than happy to help people with their projects in depth via a client-vendor relationship, but we can also refer folks to others like Ecology Artisans, Catching H2O, the San Diego Sustainable Living Institute, Tree Culture, Lumber Cycle, Dudek, and many more. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's get started. Personally, I like to start with water. Water is such a foundational component of life and landscapes that it's hard for me to imagine starting somewhere else. Depending on where in San Diego you live, you could have very different resources when it comes to water. Some areas in the county receive very little, while others might get upwards of 25 inches annually, although this often comes during a concentrated portion of the year. But unless you are fairly close to the coast and get the nightly fog layer, you probably live in a part of San Diego with a fairly brittle landscape and seasonally dry, arid climate. The brittleness refers to the periodicity and prevalence of rainfall and humidity in a landscape, not the amount of rainfall and humidity. The more brittle the landscape, the more likely that organic matter will oxidize instead of decomposing. That was a mouthful, but for simplicity, when you hear oxidize, think oxygen and air, think of things drying out, very dry grass blowing in the wind, and that feeling of brittleness breaking apart a very dry leaf. Oxidation is fine if you're turning your biomass into lumber, for instance, but suboptimal in many ways out on the landscape. One reason we might care about in San Diego is increased fire risk. Before humans came onto the scene, herbivores would help cycle that organic matter through grazing and trampling, getting it into the soil to allow for the more biologically beneficial nutrient cycling and decomposition, as opposed to the oxidation that distances the organic material from the flow of the healthy carbon cycle. In these seasonally dry, brittle landscapes, the basic framework we want to follow when it comes to rainwater is slow it, spread it, sink it. Pretty much the exact opposite of the pave it, pollute it, pipe it out of here paradigm that is the norm. Instead, we want to hold the water as high in the landscape as we can, spread the water out over the land, and get it to infiltrate into healthy soil with high levels of soil organic matter. A 1% increase in soil organic matter can yield about 20,000 gallons of increased water holding capacity per acre. I almost always recommend people max out the low-hanging fruit found in a healthy soil carbon sponge before they start thinking about actual rainwater tanks. It's like making your house more energy efficient before getting solar panels. Tanks do have the big benefit of being able to dispense the water later on though, and if you happen to live on a large enough property and have the topography where it is possible, a pond is even better. There are many different ways to execute on this slow it, spread it, sink it philosophy, from swales to rain gardens to hugelkultur beds, keyline or subsoiler plows, terracing, retention walls, check dams, detention ponds, keyline dams, deep sheet mulching, and on and on. Right here is one of the best opportunities we found on this property to harvest a decent amount of rainwater. As it comes down this culvert, Chet could fairly easily dig a diversion trench to direct the water onto his property. Then, as opposed to a flow path of the water that is going downhill, the goal is to get it to go horizontal to the slope or even back uphill if you can. There are many awesome companies in San Diego that can help you with installing these systems, like Ecology Artisans, Catching H2O, Feed the Soil, etc. So now let's talk about the soil. If we look closely at this soil under these trees here, we can see that it is very fudgy. Personally, when it comes to soil, I like my brownies more cakey, not fudgy. It seems like the soil is fairly high in clay here based on that consistency. I also noticed right away that there's basically zero ground cover. As much as possible, I try to mimic nature. She has been prototyping and doing extensive R&D on these systems for billions of years in some cases. She's got pretty awesome designs and solutions for a lot of the problems that we face. One of those is leaf litter. In terms of interventions I might do here, I'd consider aerating the soil a bit, maybe digging some small depressions, filling them with organic matter of various kinds, and then doing a thick 3 to 5 inch mulch over the entire area. From then on, I'd let the natural leaf litter collect. I also might consider planting something beneficial that enjoys the deep shade underneath. In our food-producing areas, we basically want to create a mid-successional forest ecosystem, since they are some of the most productive biological systems on the planet. One of the last items Chet and I discussed was the patch of lawn in the back. I'm personally not a huge fan of US lawns in general, given that they are one of the largest irrigated crops in the world and produce very little of value, while yielding runoff full of pesticides and fertilizers in many cases. However, maintaining some amount of functional lawn space is totally understandable, and so we talked about how to manage that space and improve it. First, stop using synthetic pesticides and herbicides. Of course, Chet doesn't use any of that, so he's already off to a good start. Unfortunately, his grass looked a bit lackluster, and personally, to deal with that, I'd consider aerating it and applying a mix of biochar and compost into the freshly aerated ground. And then if I really wanted to go the extra mile, potentially add a biostimulant like the Regenesis product that my company sells, but there are many amazing biostimulant products out there. If it were me, I'd also probably add in some clover, let the dandelions grow, which are incredibly nutritious, by the way, and add some other ground covers that handle being walked on. We also talked about Chet starting to make his own compost, which is a form of biostimulant. Composting yard waste is really low-hanging fruit, if you ask me. It's really easy, especially if you're just talking yard waste with no food, and it provides a lot of different benefits. Either you should do it, or you should have your neighbor do it, or someone down the road, but exporting organic material out of our properties and neighborhoods is a really bad idea if we can avoid it. Okay, so we're over here on the edge of the property where Chet has some brush piled up, and unfortunately right now Chet is putting out poison for rats, which can bioaccumulate as the rats are eaten by predators. So we talked about some alternatives to doing that. Of course, this type of material that could house the rats could be composted, but another thing we've been talking about is beneficial wildlife habitat, something we as a society should really spend more time considering since, according to the Stockholm Resilience Center, the extinction crisis is likely our most severe environmental crisis at the moment, followed by disruptions to the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, land system change, and then climate change at number 5. So biodiversity is a pretty big deal. A couple specific options we talked about were a brush pile for snakes and owl boxes, both of which would help with the overpopulation of gophers and rats. In this case, I recommended that if Chet wants to pursue this, he should talk to a wildlife specialist to construct habitat that is optimal for snakes, especially gopher and king snakes, and less optimal for rats. At the moment, my company doesn't have someone with the experience doing that in this region, but we would be happy to make some recommendations. Okay, so that's about it. Chet made it really easy since he's already done an incredible job with this property. He uses no petroleum-based chemicals, biodiversity seems to be fairly high on the property, and he's added a thick layer of mulch in most of the planting areas. But we definitely identified some areas where improvements could be made. Some things we didn't get to are shading of the house for summer cooling, passive solar heating in the winter, and gray water recycling. There's always more to be done. One could go on and on trying to make their property more regenerative, and we highly recommend you do your best to do so. But don't forget, none of us is an island. We are all connected, and we have to work together to change the system as a whole, or we don't stand a chance of making it through the next 50 years. Right now, my company has 3 initiatives trying to make a bigger impact that we'd love you to join us in. The first is converting the company into a multi-stakeholder cooperative. The second is a piece of legislation we're working on to establish reasonable norms for ecosystem valuation and mandate that value be accounted for on governmental financial statements. And third, we're working on a community-owned solar plus battery storage facility in Northeast San Diego County.